Welcome to Narcissist Apocalypse, everyone. I am Brandon Chadwick, and today we are going to be discussing why red flags aren't red flags until they become patterns and the psychology of the normalization of red flags, it being a specific process that occurs inside the victim, brain bias, attachment, and also on the abuser's end to help create that bias attachment. Intermittent reinforcement is occurring, and this can make red flags just not harder to see as they just gradually become these everyday things, but also you can actually sometimes see these patterns and know what could be a pattern, and you do see a pattern, but the psychology may not make these things as big as a deal anymore. And there are other things that could be attaching you to this relationship as well by this point. But before we get to that, if you want to be a guest on our Survivor Story episodes, go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com, click on our guest form button at the top of the page. There, you can fill out our guest form and press the submit button, or you can just email us at narcissistapocalypse@pm.me. Also, we have a newsletter at our website, a very informative newsletter. You can sign up at our website for it, and you get a free workbook for every Survivor Story that week. And we also have a support group at our website at narcissistapocalypse.com. And we have Zoom meetings every Wednesday night, Thursday afternoons, and Saturday nights, so you can join there. So today we are going to be discussing, as I say a lot on the show, red flags are not red flags until they become a pattern. And something that I always say on the show is sometimes you get those people that say, why didn't you see the red flags sooner? And there's a real big false assumption here that red flags present themselves as red flags. And we recently did an episode about those early boundaries. A lot of people do not see those things as even boundary tests, and that can be a red flag. But when it's not done in a pattern, it's really hard to make something of it or see it. And with these types of red flags that are going on, they're really not fully visible as a whole, because they're just pieces of something at the beginning before, abuse takes hold fully and you already are attached to the person. So that's a big, big thing. So part one here is the myth of the obvious red flag. So most of what becomes a red flag starts off as something pretty ambiguous, a boundary push framed as enthusiasm, like, come on, stay out a little longer. Don't you want to spend time with me? A dismissive comment that could be exhaustion and you genuinely aren't really sure what it is. A joke that doesn't land really well, but everyone else might have laughed, or they said they were just joking. So maybe you're being too sensitive. So with these things right here, there's not a lot of evidence of danger that is going on. There might be discomfort, and discomfort in early stages of relationship sometimes can be there where everything else is feeling good and is getting rationalized. So you're just you're trying to figure out what's going on during this time, because these things can be excused as maybe I'm overreacting, or maybe I'm making a bigger deal out of something that is not there. So these are like the small little things that could be happening. And as time moves on, an obvious red flag could be a rage. However, that could be excused away. There could be something, that they could say that was going on in their life that they didn't mean it. So time can now pass through this. Words not matching actions, or you heard it wrong, things along those lines. Sometimes that happens, but they're still a good person based upon what else is going on in the relationship. Not respecting your time thievery, but this can be explained as they're really into you, and that's why they're taking all of your time. So these are other things that could be a little bit further down the road, but can also be explained away in these one-off things because they haven't become a pattern yet at all. So this is where the myth of like the obvious red flag can happen, especially here with like a rage that can be excused away. It is the reality of it. Some people might say that, you know, I'm going to leave after that rage, but there's a lot of dynamics going on where you really have someone who's been normal a lot of the time, and with an excuse behind it, that red flag can be excused away, and things can move on within the relationship. So the next part here is attachment bias. So with all of us, what's happening underneath the surface for all of us during the early parts of relationships? Our thoughts are being formed. Our brain around this relationship is being formed. So what works against us in this relationship is an attachment bias. So when you're attracted to someone, at the beginning, your brain is releasing chemicals. You're bonding with someone. You're trying to maintain a connection with someone, especially, if you really like them. So these things that are going on, they're creating a biased perception. There's not just chemicals going around that are making you feel good. So they're confirming evidence that the relationship is safe and worth investing in. And they're going to work against everything to the contrary at that point, because your brain is and you are having a little bit of a bias here. So if someone is warm and attentive 99 times, and then suddenly they become cold and dismissive once, your brain isn't going to file that one moment as a warning sign. It might file it as an exception to an otherwise pretty positive pattern about someone. Your brain is looking for an explanation to preserve everything. It's trying to keep the narrative going. And so you might say they're stressed, they had a bad day. The abuser might give some excuses that feed into these excuses. And your brain is telling you this isn't who they really are, because you have 99 other versions of them and explanations and proof that they are not that thing. So early on in relationships, you really don't have enough data to know whether an explanation is accurate or whether the first instance of something is going to repeat. And this is just how we're wired. And that's how these early relationships and abusive relationships begin, with this attachment bias that is going on. And up next, we have a gradual desensitization and shifting baselines. So the second mechanism here, working alongside the attachment aspect of things, is desensitization. So if abusive behavior escalated immediately from like 0 to 100, that would be alarming. But the reason it rarely does, and sometimes it does in relationships, and sometimes someone does stay in those relationships, and there's a lot of fear going on in those relationships. But in the case that we're talking about, in a lot of the stories on our show, the escalation is done slowly. And this change, this gradual change, it's difficult for you to track over time when it's done gradually. We hear this a lot in our show. It's the frog in the boiling pot, or the dimming lights type of story. So the pattern here typically looks like a small boundary is pushed, followed by an apology and a period of warmth and reassurance. Then maybe a larger boundary is pushed, followed by a minimization or reassurance. And each increment is small enough that your nervous system is adjusting to everything rather than reacting to it. So what could have been uncomfortable at one point in the first month of the relationship just feels maybe like rough patches at certain points. And you might be at month 6 by this point, and you might be just saying, this is just kind of how things are. This is the wave of this relationship that is going on. And then it might be the end of the first year. So the baseline here has just constantly slowly shifted beneath you. It's moved, and it's done so very slowly. And the person inside the relationship isn't getting like these extremely clear moments where they can point out and name things per se. So you are just adapting to the environment that you are living in. So like the first time something is confusing, the second time something feels like maybe it can be a coincidence, the third time it can be explainable. These things can all be, mixed and matched together. Fourth and fifth time, you're adjusting to things, and once adjustment is beginning here, the recognition becomes much harder. And a question that you might have once asked yourself, is this behavior okay? The question now becomes, how do I make this work? And that's the shift that has occurred here, and why it's hard to, even when red flags aren't red flags until they become a pattern, when it's this gradual part, it's also hard to determine if a pattern is going on. And then the next part is there's intermittent reinforcement that could be going on. The good moments make it harder. So this is really misunderstood by people who are outside of abusive relationships, that don't get what goes on inside abusive relationships, is when the intermittent reinforcement happens, when there's a reward and then a punishment. And these things can be delivered in an unpredictable manner. And when it's done in an unpredictable manner, it actually strengthens the attachment in instead of weakening it. So in an abusive dynamic, a cycle looks like kindness and then withdrawal, affection and then criticism, validation and then contempt. So the person experiencing it really is never quite sure what version of the partner they're going to get. And that uncertainty becomes, all consuming. So your brain is now organizing around restoring good moments, the warmth, the closeness, the version of the person who makes everything feel worth it. And, this is just a response to an unpredictable reward system. And this is why gambling becomes addictive. And in the exact same way, you don't know when you're going to win or when you're going to lose, but you're waiting for that win, and you're addicted to it, and you keep going at it. So in this situation, when it comes to the intermittent reinforcement, to understand this, when something feels wrong, their natural response, your natural response, isn't to leave. It's just to try to fix it, to try to get back to that good version. So a lot of times survivors are just trying to fix things. And that intermittent reinforcement is part of why there's this psychology of normalization, and that red flags are harder to see. And then part 5 here is the pattern recognition. This is the part where things can finally become visible, and that just requires time. And time is also what is needed to create the conditions for a deep attachment. So this is why when someone says, why didn't you see it sooner? Like, that question is really an unfair question, because the pattern couldn't be visible sooner. It didn't exist yet as a pattern. It was still building. And by the time that pattern does become visible and you can see the patterns are undeniable about what is going on, the abuse victim at this point is emotionally invested. They can be financially entangled. You could be living together. You can be married. It makes separating complicated, and there's still a bond between you. So even though patterns are seen at this point, the attachment part of everything makes everything more difficult to leave. So you're seeing these things, and like, you have clarity, but maybe not even the full clarity yet. And the full clarity will come after the relationship ends. So you can see the full system of how, even when you recognize the patterns, that it was too late already, and you're reconstructing the timeline, all the small moments, you can see everything and how the abuse worked and how the psychology of everything worked. And when you're no longer attached to the person, you can really get a lot more clarity to see, those were the patterns. I was right that these were patterns. And then you really start to analyze, what were the little things at the beginning that were working? Where was that intermittent reinforcement in there? Where was the attachment aspect of things in there? Where was my brain bias in there? And you can eventually see, even when you did see patterns, that all the other things, the bias and the attachment to this person and the intertwinedness of your life at this point, even though you saw those patterns, it could carry the relationship on further and further and further. And an analogy I like to use here is, let's say you took a box, the box had no picture on it, but it was a box and it was a puzzle inside, and you just dumped all of the pieces out onto the table. So think about trying to solve a puzzle without seeing the picture on that box. And you pick up the first piece, it doesn't tell you much. Then you find another piece that might fit somewhere nearby, then another. And at first, the pieces don't look like anything. They're just shapes. They're just colors. And maybe there's a little bit of blue. Maybe there's a curved edge. Maybe something that could be part of a tree or something. Maybe part of a sky. Nothing about those first few pieces are going to tell you what the whole picture is. And if someone walked by the table and asked, like, why didn't you realize what the puzzle was earlier? The honest answer would be pretty simple: because there weren't enough pieces yet. You can't see the picture until enough pieces are on the table. And relationships work in the same way. The first uncomfortable moment is just one piece. The second might still look unrelated. The third could still look like a coincidence. But eventually enough pieces can accumulate that the picture starts to emerge. And when that happens, people often look back to say, how did I not see it? And remember, it is called a puzzle for a reason. A puzzle doesn't want to be found out right away. It has its own psychology, so you don't figure it out. Just like a relationship can have these attachments, these biases, these intermittent reinforcements, and psychology to make it difficult even once the patterns have formed. And a puzzle can start being built out and the patterns are there, but it still takes a while until you finish that puzzle. And it really can take a while to leave a relationship too. So the big takeaways here are: a single uncomfortable moment is not proof of danger. Repeated discomfort can become data. It's not clarity yet, but can become data. Attachment forms faster than patterns reveal themselves. The brain protects connection before it protects clarity. And the attachment of everything, and also ambiguity, delays recognition as well. So if you were someone who's still wondering like how you didn't see it, you were just sitting on individual moments. You weren't sitting on a pattern yet. And a single moment of discomfort in an otherwise, good relationship is not a lot of information to take action on. There is ambiguity that's going on, and that keeps you explaining, hoping, protecting, instead of making decisions. And you are forming attachments under all of this uncertainty. You're giving the benefit of the doubt to someone who had carefully earned it, and you were waiting for enough information to be sure about what is going on. And abusers really like to exploit this. And by the time those moments repeat enough to form a pattern, you are already attached to this relationships. So red flags aren't red flags when they happen at first. They become red flags when they repeat. And by the time they repeat, the person experiencing them, you, is already inside the system for a long time, which makes it harder to leave, even if there is clarity and full clarity. And I think that's where a little bit more healing can happen in the aftermath of abuse. So that was our quick episode here about red flags and the psychology and normalization of red flags and the patterns of everything. So I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it useful and found it validating and a little bit educational as well. And if you want to be a guest on our Survivor Story episodes, please go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com. Click on the guest form button at the top of the page. And also on our website, you can sign up to our newsletter, and you can sign up to our support group at narcissistapocalypse.com. And that is it for today's episode. And I hope you have a good night.